Alan Wake 2 is a survival horror third-person adventure game, which is set 13 years after the hero of the first game, a best-selling author by the name of Alan Wake, imprisoned himself in the Dark Place in order to save his wife and in turn, the world. What is the Dark Place exactly? Well, it's an alternate dimension that captures artists in order to feed on their art, and when the Dark Place is done eating said art, it excretes it back into our own reality and makes it real. The gateway to said dimension is a lake called Cauldron that can be found near a remote mountain town by the name of Bright Falls, which, after Alan's disappearance, the place has become a home to a series of ritualistic murders. As a result, the FBI sends a couple of feds to investigate said murders, and the feds in question are Saga Anderson, who seems to have been in a tanning bed accident since the last time I saw her, and her grumpy supervisor Alex Casey, who sort of resembles this grumpy New York detective that I once knew from back in the day. Anyway, as the investigation unfolds, Saga starts to get distorted interdimensional Skype calls from Alan, which help her to gradually piece together the truth about the weird goings-on in Bright Falls circa 2010, and that the more recent murders are not only connected to this incident, but are also a sign that there are forces that try to materialize the same crisis once more. In order to stop the Dark Place's influence, Saga and Alan must work together, and maybe in the process, Alan will be granted his long-awaited chance of reunion with his beloved wife. If I had to describe Alan Wake 2's story, I'd say that it's a thrilling mystery narrative that triples across multiple dimensions, which, purposefully or not, through the concept of the Dark Place, it also reflects the process of creating transcendental art that has the power to change the world for the better. Appropriately enough, Remedy chose to tell this complex story through multiple artistic and storytelling mediums, and the execution of it all is quite competent. The game does it all: in-game cinematics, live-action cinematics, musicals, songs with lyrics inspired by the story itself, and even good old-fashioned written prose. For starters, the cutscenes are absolutely brilliant, and they feature two distinct visual languages for every of its two main protagonists. The cutscenes in Saga's story, for example, are shot in a very conventional way. You know, the style of cinematography that's objectively good, but we're almost desensitized to it, because we see it in most movies and TV shows. I think that they did that in order to convey that she exists in the game's version of our own reality, so for me, it gets a thumbs up. The things get slightly more interesting when we start to follow Mr. Wake though. The angles of the shots get weirder and more awkward, to the point that some of them almost made me nauseous. That's because Alan spends most of the game trapped in a dark place, where the fabric of reality isn't exactly stable, and existence is not quite comfortable. The voice acting in the cutscenes is flawless, but the facial animations, on the other hand, look like the characters are trying to articulate their face through a mask. As I mentioned before, the game also features live-action cutscenes, which are always seen in an in-game screen, or a video projector, which is the opposite of the relationship between us and the game. They had pretty high production values when necessary, and the acting performances were great. Even the game's main writer did a good enough job. The most impressive one for me was the 15-minute short film that they made, which paralleled quite nicely with Alan's own story. Much like its prequel, Alan Wake 2 is divided into episodes/chapters, and all of them have their own ending song. The songs featured in Saga's ending, although not objectively bad, they were a bit too poppy for my tastes, and the writing style in the lyrics was kinda childish. Alan's ending song was more to my liking though, because it simply oozed with very strong Portishead energy, which, funny enough, is one of my all-time favorite bands.
Biased.
Speaking of music, since Alan Wake 1, Remedy has a tradition of putting a heavy combat segment in their games, accompanied by a classic heavy metal song, composed and performed by the studio's longtime collaborator, the band Poets of the Fall. Up until recently, my favorite of them combat segments was the one from Control, because the song was super energetic, and it was a great companion piece for the massacre that ensued in the shifting corridors of the oldest house. But since I've had the honor to experience the one in Alan Wake 2, the crown of the Rock and Remedy combat segment was swiftly taken from it. The formula was very similar, but what made the one in Alan Wake 2 more stimulating for my eyes, ears and soul were the fun lyrics and the visual of the game's actors performing the overly theatrical and campy dancing numbers. The prophetic manuscript pages also make a return, and they were as engaging to read through as the ones from the first game. And if you can't be bothered to read them yourself, you can ask Alan to do it for you. While Alan does the reading, you'll bear witness to oddly angled pictures of Alan's writing room, which is somewhat unsettling, and in my opinion, a very nice touch. If there's anything to criticize in this game's story, is the fact that they've artificially dragged the ending for so long, only for it to pose even more mysteries and end on a cliffhanger. For me personally, it isn't such a big deal, since I only finished the first game 2 months ago, but for the people who waited for 13 years to get a somewhat conclusive sequel, I think it's a much bigger letdown. Unlike its action horror prequel, Alan Wake 2 is a proper, modern survival horror game, whose gameplay is very much inspired by the recent Resident Evil remakes, and you know what? It's a change that I welcomed with open arms. Ammo is scarce, the enemies are aggressive and nimble, and the bastards can withstand quite a lot of damage. Before you can actually hurt the baddies, you first need to destroy the veil of darkness that surrounds them, and you do that by shining the light on them with the help of your trusty flashlight or other portable light sources. The shady dudes from Alan's campaign were especially nerve-wracking to deal with, because not all of them are malicious, and the ones who are don't show their murderous intent until the very last second. This led me to frequently waste precious photon projecting resources on crowds of unsuspecting shadow people, and most of the time, it turned out that they were the pacifist kind.
Double waste.
Even though it's dangerous, it's a good idea to thoroughly explore the multitude of sprawling locales that the game takes place in, because eventually, you're bound to find life-saving supply stashes, new weapons, and even magical bullshit trinkets that upgrade the stats of your characters and your weapons to boot. The supply stashes are usually locked though, so in order to get the appropriate key, you'll need to solve some very engaging and well-balanced puzzles. I have to admit that ever since Control, Remedy have become my favorite puzzle designers for these kinds of games, because their puzzles are just challenging enough not to frustrate you, but still make you feel clever after you solve them. If you decide to follow through with my advice about thorough exploration, your inventory space will start to feel a bit limited. So, you'll have to engage yourself in some inventory management. What will be very helpful with the whole inventory management thing is the classic survival horror staple, the good old item box. Which is used to store momentarily unneeded supplies. In Alan Wake 2, both of the main characters have their own version of the Mind Palace concept, which helps them progress within their own respective narratives. Saga's variation is called the Mind Place, which resembles her and her partner's investigation room. In the Mind Place you can view maps, read manuscript pages that you collect throughout the levels, listen to songs or radio broadcasts, upgrade her weapons, and most importantly, you can profile your suspects and pin collected evidence on the caseboard. The caseboard made me feel as a true detective, and I really enjoyed collecting and connecting clues, which was also very useful for keeping myself up with the mystery. Unfortunately, it could also be a bit frustrating at times, when moments integral for the progression of the story wouldn't trigger, unless I've done all the busy work involving the board. Alan's variant of the concept is called the Writer's Room, and it has a similar layout to the study in Bird Lake Cabin, albeit larger. In contrast to Saga's Mind Place, Alan's Writer's Room is dimly lit and barren. Aside from his desk, a map board, a chalkboard, a chair and a TV, and a table with a radio. The most useful of the furnishings that I just mentioned is the chalkboard, because it can be used by us to change the layout of certain scenes in order for us to progress, which, needless to say, is a pretty cool mechanic. Alan Wake 2 is one of the most visually impressive games around, both technically and artistically. On the PC, the game makes use of the latest ray tracing and image reconstruction techniques, which results in a game that supports highly realistic real-time light propagation, while the visual noise is kept to a minimum. On top of that, the environments are brimming with geometric detail, which made the hunt for supplies and collectibles quite an exhilarating experience. The game is also great at creating atmosphere, and compared to its predecessor, it looks much grimier and more imposing. It also does some interesting stuff with contrasting colored lighting, and at times, when you're simply moving through the environments, they overlapped footage from the opposite dimension, which was a very cool and trippy visual. Despite the dragged out and inconclusive ending, Alan Wake 2 is quite an experience in terms of storytelling. It creatively uses different mediums to tell quite a compelling story, and the execution of it all is almost flawless. I also like the franchise's gameplay shift into the realm of survival horror, which is a genre that suits the story perfectly. As for the audio-visual experience, well, as you might have noticed, it's simply immaculate. Alan Wake 2 was one of my most anticipated games when it first got announced back in 2021, and now that I finally played it, it has become my personal game of the year. I simply cannot wait to experience the next continuation of the narrative, but until that moment comes, there's nothing for me to do but wait. Thank you guys for watching, and if I manage to make another video, I hope I'll see you guys in the next one. Have a nice day!